Brexit was the right move versus Brexit should have never happened. The debate on whether the United Kingdom did the right thing or shot itself in the foot by leaving the European Union is never ending, primarily because of the very public opinions on the matter. Some agree with it, and then some don't. Moreover, there are subcategories within those two, with people presenting different takes on Brexit. If we look at this chart here, it shows the age distribution of the 33,551,983 valid votes during the 2016 referendum. You'll notice that the majority of young voters, that's the under 35 categories, were more likely to vote to remain compared to older age groups. But why do you think that is? We have to acknowledge a few things about Brexit, starting with the generational divide that is created. Obviously, Brexit was a one-time decision that would impact the socio-economic and political landscape of the United Kingdom for years and years to come. For the younger generation, this meant the next several decades, and for the older generation, this meant the next few decades. The decision therefore impacted the lives of the younger generation more so than it did of that of the older generation. At least that's how they perceived it. Brexit was never a war between the Tories and the Labour Party. It was never about the Liberals and the Conservatives. If anything, it was about the younger generation versus the older ones, and who made up the majority. At least that's how a lot of people view the Brexit war, more of a generational war than anything else. In The Road to Somewhere, the populist revolt and the future of politics author David Goodhart categorises Brexit voters into two groups: the anywheres and the somewheres. More specifically, we're talking about the degree-educated, geographically mobile professionals who embrace new people and experiences and define themselves by their achievements, the anywheres. Then we're talking about those with fixed identities rooted in their hometown community, unsettled by rapid change, particularly in the influx of migrants, the growth of multi-ethnic cities, and more fluid gender identities, the somewheres. It's easy to tell the age range into which anywheres and somewheres fall. Anyway, Goodhart's work delves into the cultural and political divides that have fueled populism in the modern age. Published in 2017, Goodhart uses Brexit as the perfect example to showcase the real divide in the United Kingdom: the anywheres and the somewheres. This description might seem a lot more simplistic than how many analysts have described it, but Goodhart argues that it all boils down to how there are two groups of people: those who thrive in modernity and those who are afraid of it. Brexit isn't the only example Goodhart could come up with. In the Western world, two major events, one of which was the UK's withdrawal from the EU, have shaped the socio-economic and political landscape to a great extent. Besides Brexit, Donald Trump would be entering office in the United States for the first time. Goodhart uses these examples to showcase how the somewheres who once thrived long ago have started to feel left behind. The author argued that the somewheres have started to feel alienated by rapid social changes and believe that their traditional values are under threat. To level the playing field, Goodhart provided examples of how the somewheres had validated their arguments and how it would be unfair to call them, that's the older generation, inherently bad people. At most, they were just fearful of an ever-changing world, one that they found hard to keep up with. How does this revert back to Brexit? Shortly after the 2016 referendum, the London School of Economics and Political Science conducted a study called UK Youth Perspectives and Priorities for Brexit Negotiations. In it, they found that a majority of the younger generation were particularly concerned with how the Brexit vote would impact the many multi-ethnic populations living within the United Kingdom. Moreover, they were also concerned with how leaving the European Union would limit them in finding employment, seeking better educational opportunities, and altogether restrict their mobility in some way. To substantiate these arguments, they gave very specific examples of just how Brexit would impact their future. Here's a chart taken from the LSE study, and you can see how every argument is backed by very logical examples, ones that you'd have to agree with. For example, when asked to elaborate on the EU membership benefits they believe they'd be losing, the sample population give examples of Erasmus, healthcare, family members in other countries, and quick starting stamps at borders. All of these ties with the Goodhart's argument is that the populist movement led by the somewheres was what ultimately led to Brexit becoming a reality. Yes, the somewheres were the majority, but they hadn't really been overtly vocal about their Euroscepticism until 2015. That's something that's displayed in this chart here. It showcases the share of people in the country that want their country to leave the EU going from 1992 to 2019. You can clearly see where the graph shoots up and how since the referendum result it's gone back down. This begs the question, what changed? What motivated the somewheres to take a more hardline approach when it came to leaving the EU? We have to acknowledge a few facts here. It wasn't as if the older generation wanted to leave the EU. It's true that Eurosceptics existed on both sides, and likewise those who believed EU membership was beneficial also existed on both sides. However, these people were largely outliers, and our whole discussion here is based on the majority. Now that that's clear, Goodhart presented an interesting case. The somewhere sense of disenfranchisement and how populist movements capitalized on that sense of isolation. Most of the EU's policies that were driven by economic globalization and multiculturalism were beneficial to their anywheres. Then again, they overlooked the cultural and economic concerns of the somewhere majority. This imbalance, Goodhart suggests, has created fertile ground for populist movements that promise to restore a sense of agency and identity to the disenfranchised. Traditionally, populist movements are brought on by a different sort of divide. That would be the more typical monetary divide, and populism would spark as a result of economic imbalances. But Brexit was the exception to the rule. In this case, the imbalance was one of rapid globalization, maybe at a pace too rapid for its own good. The best example here would be of that of immigration. Did immigration cause Brexit? Take a look at this chart here. This graph was prepared in 2023 by Migration Observatory to showcase the different attitudes of the British public when it came to immigration. Participants were asked two questions. Do you think the number of immigrants coming to Britain nowadays should be increased or reduced, or should it remain the same? And do you think immigration is a good thing or a bad thing for Britain? It's clear that the majority believe that the British government should work on reducing immigration, and the number of people who believed that immigration was bad was similar to those who believed it was good for the UK. Brexit wasn't because of a singular issue, but immigration was a key issue. Per the EU's fundamental laws, every citizen of a member state reserves the right to freely move between one member state and another. This was discussed under the EU's freedom of movement law. While the UK was a staunch supporter of this law when it came to trade, services and capital, it was when it came to people that they became increasingly concerned, particularly after the EU's Eastern European expansions. This graph shows the number of Polish nationals resident in the United Kingdom from 2008 to 2021. You'll notice that the numbers were consistently rising from 2008, reaching an all-time high in 2017, and then the numbers started to drop. The only major event from 2016 to 2017, when there were more Polish people living in the UK, to 2021 when the numbers were going down, was Brexit. Concerns over immigration levels and their impact on national identity, public services, and employment opportunities were significant factors that influenced the Leave vote. Notably, older generations were more inclined to cite immigration as the primary reason for supporting Brexit compared to younger voters. In the years leading up to the 2016 referendum, the UK experienced a substantial increase in immigration, particularly from EU member states. Many Britons perceived this influx as a strain on public services, housing, and the labour market. Experts believe that areas with higher levels of deprivation and lower skills were more likely to vote Leave, indicating that economic factors intertwined with concerns about immigration influence voting behaviour. As discussed, older individuals had a stronger attachment to the traditional British identity and believed that the cultural changes brought about by increased immigration as a threat to that identity. Some older voters, particularly those in areas with limited economic opportunities, believed that immigrants came as competitors for jobs and resources. In contrast, younger generations, having grown up in a more multicultural and interconnected Europe, were generally more supportive of the EU and less likely to view immigration negatively. Still, Brexit didn't mean the UK solved its immigration problems. The Leave group made some very bold claims in the lead up to the referendum, one of which was that Brexit would help the UK take back control over immigration. Brexit would introduce two changes. ending the freedom of movement for EU citizens and withdrawing from EU agreements on third country immigration. Effectively, by withdrawing from the Union, Westminster would be able to restrict free entry into the country and reduce the number of migrants substantially. In theory, this made sense. However, the immigration issue didn't pan out in exactly the way Leave campaigners had hoped. During the 2016 Brexit campaign, Nigel Farage emphasised that EU membership meant uncontrolled immigration. Yet, the UK's pre-Brexit immigration controls already existed. Notably, the UK wasn't part of the Schengen area, while Brexit reduced EU migration. This trend had already begun. From 2014 to 2015, EU net migration was 212,000, largely from Central and Eastern Europe. By 2019, this dropped to 48,000, partly due to improving economic conditions in these countries and Germany becoming a more attractive destination. For example, Poland's GDP per capita rose from 12.5% of the UK's in 2003 to 40% by 2019. How will Brexit impact the next generation? If you were born between 1997 and 2012, you're part of the current generation that's old enough to understand the complexities of world politics. You're part of Generation Z, better known as Gen Z. Arguably, the generation that's the most impacted by Brexit is Gen Zs. They're the ones who might have been old enough to vote during the 2016 referendum, but the generation that will have to live with its consequences. Ending the free movement was one of the slogans for the Leave group, but many experts believe that the campaign didn't take into account how it would affect young Britons. In this case, we have to remember that Britons had the right to freely travel between member states, seeking employment opportunities anywhere in the world. Freedom of movement ensured that these fundamental rights and freedoms were protected under EU law. This means that as a citizen of a member state, you wouldn't have to go through the rigorous and taxing process of having to apply for a visa, get your documents in order, and still face rejection. Moreover, some work visas don't recognise temporary jobs as real jobs. So, yes, freedom of movement did immobilise people who wanted to enter the United Kingdom, but it also restricted the movement of those who wanted to leave the country too. One immediate consequence of Brexit is the added complexity in cross-border trade. Without the free movement of goods and services, businesses must now contend with custom checks, tariffs, and additional paperwork. This disrupts supply chains, especially for industries reliant on the seamless exchange of components and finished products. For instance, companies like BMW, Honda, and Nissan previously operated UK-based factories because of EU membership, which allowed for the efficient movement of parts across borders. Economists widely agree that international trade fuels economic growth. Reduced trade with Europe will likely result in slower growth, impacting job creation and wage increases. A sluggish economy also limits government's capacity to fund education, training, and apprenticeships, further hindering long-term job prospects for young workers. Brexit proponents argue that reduced immigration may improve domestic job opportunities. However, while fewer immigrants may ease competition for certain jobs, the overall slowdown in economic growth could result in fewer job opportunities overall. To minimize harm, experts advocate negotiating reciprocal visa regimes with the EU to preserve opportunities for young people to study, work, and travel abroad. For young people, the losses in rights, prospects, and opportunities are a high price to pay for uncertain future gains. Staying aligned with EU economic arrangements may offer the best chance to limit these impacts and secure a more stable economic future. The older generation voted, and the younger generation has to live with the consequences of the results. A term that's gained popularity in the aftermath of the UK's withdrawal is Brexit. That is, the growing number of Britons who believe that maybe the EU was beneficial to the UK after all. As is evident, younger age groups had a greater tendency to vote to remain. This is elaborated by this map here. It shows areas in the UK where voters majority voted to stay or leave the EU, and how age played a part in the decision-making process. Can the younger generation hold another referendum to rejoin the EU? It is unlikely the UK will hold another referendum on rejoining the EU within the next decade due to political, economic, and social factors. Politically, rejoining lacks cross-party consensus with major parties focused on domestic issues. Economically, the EU may impose stricter conditions for re-entry, making negotiations complex and less appealing. Socially, Brexit fatigue and divisions remain, with public opinion still polarised. Additionally, rebuilding trust with the EU and aligning with its evolving policies would require significant time and effort. Was this the consequence of Brexit that older generations should have considered before they cast their vote in 2016?